But the question remains, what is housing benefit for? Is it the role of government spending to allow poorer people to continue living in more expensive parts of the country? It's a social as well as a financial debate. Charlotte Pickles again.
If you look at some of the reforms, they've been quite popular when you look at polling. We as the public don't think that housing benefits should be enabling people to live in areas that we can't afford. We do think we should be supporting people, making sure that people have a roof over their head, making sure that there is support for housing costs when people can't afford them. But we think there should be limits on this. It's probably not reasonable to provide it in very, very costly areas.
Of course, the critique of that policy is that if you don't make it possible for poor people to live in expensive parts of the country, you get lack of social cohesion, you get people living next door to people who are just like them, you don't get a shared citizenship.
Yes, I think that is true. I would also counter that in many areas there aren't people living in very mixed communities at the moment and weren't initially anyway. So I think it's a bit disingenuous to sort of say that, before housing benefit reform, everybody was all merrily living together. That just wasn't true. I mean, at the time when we did the reforms, people talked a lot about social cleansing, which I found quite an appalling way of expressing the reforms. Aside from that language, actually, when you think about it, we're talking about the private rental sector here. We're not talking about the social housing. So that's housing provided either by local authorities or by housing associations, of which there are more people in receipt of housing benefit living in those types of properties than there are in the private rental sector. And these changes don't affect those. So you will be able to go to Westminster, you'll be able to go to Islington, you'll be able to go to all those central London areas and beyond and still find significant numbers of people being supported by housing benefit in social housing in very expensive areas.
Go to Westminster, she said. So that's exactly what I did. And there I met Colin Barrow, the former Conservative leader of the council. He wrestled with exactly this issue.
If you want Buckingham Palace and the West End and the casinos and the nightlife and the tourism and Big Ben and the buses and everything that makes London famous all over the world, if you want all of that, you've got to have people to do it. And people are not going to commute in from Guildford to drive a bus in London. It's not economic. And frankly, the people who live in glossy houses in Mayfair are not going to provide those services.
So I think you're saying that the housing benefit system is not only sustainable, it's necessary. We have to have it if we're going to have life as we know it, particularly in a city like London.
Yes, it is fashionable among Conservative commentators to imagine that housing benefit, like any other benefit, is something paid to people who are out of work. It is, and it's got a vital part in that area. But it's also paid to people who are in work to make sure that they can be in the right place doing the right sorts of things. I, for one, prefer to have a city where there is a mixed community, where all sorts of people live, than one where only rich people live.
So for you in running Westminster Council, actually the whole housing benefit system was absolutely central and vital to your view of what Westminster and indeed the rest of London ought to look like. Without it, we would have a completely different city and one you'd be much less comfortable with.
Yeah, absolutely. If it is necessary to provide a subsidy to get the right mix of people in an expensive part of town, then I think it's a price worth paying. I don't think claims on the taxpayer are things that should be entered into lightly, but I think it is a price worth paying for what we get out of that. There is an element of magic in that, and as one of the most successful cities in the world, we must be getting something right.
Former Conservative Minister David Willetts also sees the benefits of mixed communities, but he has a different idea about who should pay.
I don't think there is an obligation on the generality of taxpayers automatically to meet people's housing costs when they are living in very high-cost parts of the country. The question is why they are living there. And if they are living there because they are providing services, they are working as cleaners in the expensive offices of bankers in the city, then those bankers need to be paying the proper rate so that the cleaners that they want in their offices at 5:30 in the morning to clean them can live sufficiently close by to get in and do that job. What they can't expect is the rest of us as taxpayers to meet some of those costs. One of the effects of this housing benefit has been, in effect, to subsidise high-cost employment in high-cost areas, and that isn't something that you should expect the social security budget to do.
But if you're talking about people of working age, I think what you're really saying is that there is a very tough trade-off here, but maybe we have to give up on the idea of genuinely mixed communities in those very expensive parts of London and the South East and other cities.
There is an issue about how mixed these communities can be. My view is that our great cities like London, but also, Birmingham and Manchester, they need such a wide range of services and such a wide range of skills, and they attract people from a wide range of backgrounds, that they're going to carry on being mixed communities. But it's very important that the employers in those areas pay the wages that reflect the housing costs in those areas. There's another paradox here, and it's a paradox that I've wrestled with, which is, why is it that you see high levels of migration into very high housing cost areas? You might expect migrants to go to low cost areas, but the evidence appears to be that migrants will accept more dense living conditions than people who have been used to living in British housing for a long time. And so what you find is, and they can be anything from Australian students to Polish builders, they will rent a room, but instead of it being for one person or a couple, they'll stick in a couple of bunk beds and you'll have 4 people in that room. And the higher the house prices go, the greater their competitive advantage in the local labour market if they are willing to be more intensely housed than other people are. It does at least mean that these areas remain mixed, because there are some people who are willing to work in those areas and live in very crowded accommodation.
Charlotte Pickles, former advisor to Ian Duncan Smith, has been wrestling with another dilemma. That is that the number of people claiming housing benefit has become so big that the housing benefit itself is driving the market.
Of the private rental sector at the moment, 40% of those people renting are actually in receipt of housing benefit. If you look at how that actually plays out over the country, obviously different regions has different proportions, it's as high as 66% in southern seaside towns. So that's the majority of the market being funded, at least in part, by housing benefit. Now, the government did do an evaluation after the introduction of the local housing allowance, 2 years after the introduction. And essentially what that showed was, whilst private rents were actually decreasing in that period, what happened with the local housing allowance is actually those rates either went up or they flattened.
So landlords were taking advantage of the fact
Exactly.
They knew they had tenants whose rent would be paid.
And moved up to the maximum amount that the government would pay.
Partly in response to these concerns, the last government did make some fairly radical changes to housing benefit. If you're renting in the private sector, it is now much less likely to cover all of your rent. That should help keep the bill under control, but it leaves a lot of people out of pocket. It's not just direct government policy, though, which sets the housing benefit bill. There's been another dramatic change over the last decade or so, which augurs rather badly. Remember that old promise of a property-owning democracy? Well, rates of home ownership have been plummeting. So when Nick Pearce of the Institute for Public Policy Research looks into his crystal ball, he sees a rather murky future.
If fewer people own their own homes in their 30s and in their 40s, they carry on renting. When they come to retirement and they don't have a property that they own, they will have to turn to the state. If their income is low, they haven't got a decent pension. Of course, many, many thousands of millions of people will be in that situation. They will have to turn to the state for help with their housing costs.
So there are long-term drivers pushing the bill up even further. So what is the answer? Well, first and foremost, there seems to be complete unanimity on one question.
We should be really having a very quick, intensive investment in building houses within the social rental sector.
More large-scale council house building, as well as private sector development and as well as development by housing associations.
Not enough housing is being built, and if we want to see it happen, it's got to be a mixture of public and private incentives to do that.
The Conservative and Labour voices there sound virtually indistinguishable, all supporting more house building, including by the public sector. But actually, the reason we have this enormous £25 billion housing benefit bill goes much deeper than simply our failure to build enough homes. It's the cost of failure right across our housing policy, and it also reflects our attitude to property. John Hills again.
What we're doing with the housing benefit bill is, in a way, picking up the costs, picking up the price of a lot of other failures in the housing market. One is that we live in such an unequal society that people who already own owner-occupied houses don't mind too much if their prices go up. Frankly, they may worry about whether their kids can get on the housing ladder, but they themselves are protected. But people who are on much the same incomes as they used to be now face much higher rents. It's a much bigger problem than it used to be. The other side of it that we're picking up is just our difficulty in creating housing supply, in coping with increased demand for housing. And those two things are actually linked. In a normal market, when a price goes up, people economise on whatever it is. If one kind of vegetable is too expensive, they'll buy less of that and buy something else. The trouble with the housing market is, with so much of it dominated by an occupation, if the price of an owner-occupier's house goes up, they're under no great pressure to sell it or to use less of it and to bring in lodgers. In fact, they might even think, oh, house prices go up, we'd better hang on to it, even though we've got lots of empty bedrooms, because we know that it's the best investment around. That means that although we've got more bedrooms per person than we've ever had, in that sense we don't have a shortage of housing supply, they're very unequally distributed. And that means there's less, if you like, left over for the people in the rental market, whether it's the social rental market or the private rental market, and the prices are very high. That's the product of the way we've taxed housing and the way we've taxed other wealth for generations.
If you're sitting there as an affluent person observing how much your house has increased in value in the last 10 or 20 years, remember that one thing that your taxes are having to go to pay for is pay for the housing benefit to meet the rents of the people who may not be so far away from you, who can't afford the high rents that are the corollary of these very high house prices. So that's one of the ways. This apparent sort of unanticipated benefit, just your house is worth a hell of a lot. People should remember it's in turn actually one of the factors driving the surge in welfare bills and welfare dependency, and it's one of the many bad consequences of insufficient housing and very high house prices.
David Willits again. Back in her rented flat, Carol is one of the casualties of those ever higher house prices. Does the whole system make sense from where you're sitting?
No, it doesn't actually. A lot of taxpayers' money is being spent on housing benefit, which is certainly not the tenant's fault.
So from your point of view, the housing benefit is going into the pocket of your landlord,
Absolutely.
not into your pocket?
Of course. The money goes to the landlord. So it's a little bit like a Robin Hood antidote, really. You take from the poor and you give to the rich. That's the rental market.
And if the rest of us are paying for Carol, and millions like her, it's because our political system has failed so comprehensively to deal with housing. If lack of a coherent housing policy is one of the biggest social and economic problems facing the country, and I believe it is, then the £25 billion housing benefit bill is the most obvious cost of that failure. It's the cost of generations of politicians cosseting and undertaxing homeowners, pushing up house prices, and building far too few new homes.
Analysis was presented by Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and produced by Adam Bowen.